My name is Ezra Stus, and the story I'm about to share will challenge everything you thought you knew about faith, salvation, and the path to God's heart. For 42 years, I lived what many would consider the perfect life of devotion. I followed every rule and tradition with unwavering commitment. But one crisp autumn morning in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, everything I believed about salvation was turned upside down during 14 minutes and 20 seconds of clinical death. Before I tell you about my encounter with Jesus and the profound truth he revealed to me, you need to understand where I came from. I grew up in a world defined by strict order, deep tradition, and unwavering faith, or at least what we believed faith to be. I was born the third of 9 children in a traditional old-order Amish family. Our farmhouse, built by my great-grandfather, stood proudly amidst rolling fields of corn and wheat. Like generations before us, we lived without electricity, automobiles, or the countless modern conveniences that the English, our term for non-Amish people, take for granted. Each morning began before dawn, and every day was filled with honest work. Every evening ended with family prayer and scripture reading. My father, Benjamin Stoltzfus, served as a deacon in our church district. He was a man of few words but deep conviction, whose calloused hands and weathered face told the story of a life devoted to God through labor and service. My mother, Hannah, embodied the gentle strength that Amish women are known for. She rose before anyone else to prepare breakfast, managed the household with quiet efficiency, and taught us the ways of our people through patient example. From my earliest memories, the UN, our community set of rules and traditions, shaped every aspect of our lives. It wasn't just a list of do's and don'ts. It was the framework through which we understood our relationship with God and our place in the world. We believed that each rule, each restriction, each carefully maintained tradition was a stepping stone on the path to salvation. I remember sitting in our one-room schoolhouse, not just learning reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also the deeper lessons of what it meant to be Amish. Our teacher, Brother Eli, would often tell us that the world outside changes like the wind, but God's truth remains steady like the mountains. We took pride in our separation from the modern world, seeing it as proof of our dedication to God. As I grew older, my commitment to our ways only deepened. While some of my peers struggled with the restrictions, I embraced them. When my best friend Aaron left the community during his Rumspringa, a period of experiencing the outside world before choosing baptism, I remained steadfast. I saw his departure not just as a personal loss, but as confirmation of my own spiritual superiority. Now, I recognize that pride for what it was, but at the time, it felt like righteousness. At 21, I was baptized into the church, making a public commitment to live by the Ordnung for the rest of my life. It was a moment of tremendous pride for my family, especially my father. I can still see the tears in my mother's eyes as I emerged from the water, officially a member of the church, and we believed firmly on the path to salvation. 2 years later, I married Rebecca Yoder, the daughter of another respected family in our community. Our wedding was exactly what an Amish wedding should be: simple, focused on God, and celebrated by the entire community. Together, we built our life on the foundation of tradition and hard work. We raised 5 children, teaching them the same values and beliefs that had been passed down to us. Our farm prospered under God's blessing, or so we believed. We grew organic produce, raised dairy cows, and maintained a successful business selling handcrafted furniture to English tourists. Every success, every good harvest, every healthy child seemed to confirm that we were living rightly before God. But there were moments, quiet moments in the pre-dawn darkness or late at night, after everyone else had gone to bed, when questions would creep into my mind. I would push them away, seeing them as temptations to be resisted. When I encountered English Christians who spoke of a personal relationship with Jesus, I dismissed their experiences as emotional and ungrounded. We had something better, I thought, a proven path to God through faithful obedience and separation from the world. The morning that changed everything started like any other. It was October 15th, and the air had that particular crispness that marks the heart of autumn in Lancaster County. The leaves on the maple tree lining our property had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, and the morning mist was just beginning to lift from the fields. I had started jogging a few years earlier, after our bishop had reluctantly agreed that some concessions to modern health practices were acceptable. It was my one small rebellion against tradition. Though I justified it as good stewardship of the body God had given me, every morning before the real work of the day began, I would run along the quiet country roads that connected our farms. That morning, I remember feeling especially content with life. Our youngest son had just been accepted as an apprentice to one of the best furniture makers in the community. Our oldest daughter was preparing for her own wedding to a respectable young man from a neighboring district. The harvest had been good, and our business was thriving. By every measure, we felt that God was showing his approval of our faithful living. I had just passed the Miller farm about 2 miles into my usual route when the first warning signs appeared. A tightness in my chest, which I initially dismissed as just the morning's exertion, began to take hold. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of pink and orange. I remember thinking how beautiful it was, how it testified to God's glory. Then came the pain, sudden, crushing, like nothing I had ever experienced before. It felt as if my chest was caught in a giant vice, squeezing tighter with each heartbeat. I tried to call out, but no sound came. The last thing I saw was the gravel road rushing up to meet me as my legs gave way. What happened next would shatter every assumption I had ever made about God, salvation, and true meaning of faith. But before I tell you about my encounter with Jesus and the overwhelming truth he revealed, you need to understand just how deeply our beliefs about salvation through works and tradition were woven into the fabric of our lives. In our community, salvation was understood as something earned through faithful obedience. We didn't explicitly teach this. Indeed, we would have denied believing in works-based salvation if asked directly. But in practice, our entire lives were built around the idea that following the Ordnung, the rules, maintaining separation from the world, and preserving our traditions were the surest path to heaven. We saw ourselves as guardians of true Christianity, keeping alive the pure faith that had been corrupted by the modern world. Our simple dress, our horse-drawn buggies, our rejection of modern technology. These weren't just cultural preferences, but spiritual necessities. Each rule followed, each tradition maintained, was another brick in the wall of our salvation. Looking back now, I can see how this belief system created a subtle but pervasive pride in our hearts. We viewed ourselves as more faithful, more obedient, and more pleasing to God than others. When we saw English churches adapting to modern times, we shook our heads in disapproval, certain that we had chosen the better path. Even our charity and good works, which were substantial and sincere, were tainted by this mindset. We helped our neighbors, shared with those in need, and worked hard to support our community. But underneath it all was the unspoken belief that these actions were earning us favor with God. On the morning of my heart attack, I had been planning to attend a church leadership meeting where we would discuss strengthening some of our community's rules. There had been concerns about young people becoming too worldly, about small compromises threatening our way of life. Now I understand that our fears about losing our traditions were masking a deeper fear, the terror of discovering that perhaps we had built our spiritual house on a foundation of sand. But God, in His mercy, was about to show me a truth so powerful, so liberating, that it would transform not just my understanding of salvation, but the very way I experienced His love. Through 14 minutes and 20 seconds of clinical death, Jesus Himself would reveal to me the difference between religion and relationship, between earning and receiving, between the heavy yoke of tradition and the light burden of grace. What happened next would not only change my life, but would begin a quiet revolution of grace in our community, though not without cost. The truth, as Jesus said, would indeed set us free, but first, it would shatter everything we thought we knew about how to reach God's heart. The transition from life to death wasn't sudden. It was more like slowly sinking into deep water. The pain in my chest, which had been so overwhelming just moments before, began to fade into a curious numbness. The gravel road beneath my cheek no longer felt cold and sharp. Instead, I experienced a gradual detachment, as if every physical sensation was being gently pulled away, layer by layer. I later learned that Martha Zimmerman, an English neighbor who had been driving to an early shift at the local diner, found me on the road. But in that moment, I watched the scene unfold from above, as if I were floating near the ceiling of an invisible room. I saw her car slow down, saw her rush out with her cell phone, something forbidden in our community, but which would save my life that day. I watched her kneel beside my body, her hands shaking as she checked for a pulse. The paramedics arrived in what seemed like both an instant and an eternity. Time had lost all meaning. I observed them working on my physical form with a strange detachment, the chest compressions, the defibrillator shocks, the urgent voices calling out medical terms. I didn't understand what was happening. It felt like I was watching a scene from one of those English movies I'd occasionally glimpsed through the windows while making deliveries in town. Except this was terrifyingly real. Then, the darkness came, but it wasn't the gentle darkness of a summer evening, or even the profound darkness of our farmhouse on a moonless night. This was a darkness with substance, a suffocating weight that pressed in on me from all sides. It felt ancient, as if I had been plunged to the void that existed before God said, "Let there be light." In that darkness, I became acutely aware of my consciousness in a way I had never experienced before. Though I had no physical body, I felt more present, more aware than I ever had in life. Every thought, every emotion seemed to crystallize, to intensify. and with that heightened awareness came an overwhelming sense of my own spiritual condition. All my life, I had believed that my adherence to the Ordnung, the rules, my separation from the world, and my careful following of tradition had earned me favor with God. But in that moment, in the crushing darkness, I saw the truth of my heart with devastating clarity. Images from my life began to flash before me, not as a simple replay of events like others had described in near-death experiences, but with full understanding of my hidden motives and unacknowledged pride. I saw myself at church, dressed in the plain style of our people, feeling a subtle satisfaction in believing I was more holy than the English who drove by in their cars. I saw myself rejecting modern farming equipment, taking pride in doing things the pure way, all the while judging fellow Amish who had accepted some modern adaptations. I watched myself teaching my children about our ways, and I realized how I had unknowingly taught them to trust in works rather than grace. The weight of this revelation was crushing. Each memory brought fresh waves of conviction, showing me how I had substituted religious performance for a genuine relationship with God. The darkness seemed to intensify, as if responding to my growing awareness of my spiritual poverty. I thought of the rich young ruler who had approached Jesus, confident in his religious observance, saying, "All these things I have kept from my youth." Just as I had prided myself on keeping all our traditions, now I understood Jesus' response with painful clarity. The young man, like me, had missed the heart of God while clinging to the rules of men. In that darkness, I began to experience what I can only describe as spiritual vertigo. Everything I had built my life upon, every certainty I had claimed, seemed to crumble beneath me. The comfortable walls of tradition and ritual that had defined my entire existence were dissolving, leaving me exposed and vulnerable in a way I had never known. I tried to pray, but the memorized prayers of my lifetime felt hollow and inadequate. I reached for scripture verses, but they slipped away from me like water through my fingers. All my religious knowledge, all my years of faithful observance, offered no comfort in this place of absolute truth. The darkness continued to press in, and with it came a terror unlike anything I had ever known. It wasn't a fear of physical death. I was already beyond that. It was the terror of realizing that I had built my entire life on a foundation that was now revealing itself to be insufficient. I had thought I was on the narrow path to salvation, but had I merely been walking a trail of human tradition? Time had no meaning in this place. What felt like years might have been mere seconds in the physical world. I experienced a complete unraveling of my religious identity. Every doctrine I had held, every practice I had maintained, every tradition I had treasured, all of it was stripped away until I was left with nothing but the raw, naked truth of who I was before God. And who was I? Not the righteous man I had imagined myself to be. Not the exemplary Amish father or community member I had prided myself on being. Instead, I saw myself as I truly was, a man who had substituted the shadow for the substance, who had chosen the comfort of rules over the challenge of a genuine relationship with God. Just when the weight of this revelation seemed unbearable, when the darkness felt as though it would crush whatever remained of my soul, something changed. At first, it was barely perceptible, just a slight lessening of the darkness, a tiny pinpoint of light in the infinite void. But that pinpoint grew, not gradually, but exponentially, as if a door to another reality was being flung open. The light that now poured in was unlike anything in physical creation. It was living light, light that seemed to carry within it the very essence of life and love. It penetrated every part of my consciousness, illuminating corners of my being I hadn't even known existed. Yet, despite its overwhelming intensity, there was nothing in this light that felt overwhelming. It was pure. It was love. It was grace. It didn't hurt to look at the light. In fact, it felt like coming home to a place I had never been, but always knew deep down. As the light grew stronger, I became aware of a presence. More than just a presence, a person. Though I had no physical eyes to see with, I perceived him more clearly than I had ever seen anything in my earthly life. Jesus Christ stood before me, and every preconceived notion I had ever held about him melted away in the reality of his presence. He was nothing like the stern, judgmental figure I had imagined, nor was he the weak, modernized Jesus I had sometimes accused the English churches of following. He was utterly holy, utterly other, radiating an authority so powerful that it made every earthly power seem insignificant in comparison. And yet, he was more approachable, more personally present than anyone I had ever encountered. His eyes held depths of love I never knew were possible. When I looked into his eyes, I didn't just see love for humanity. I saw love for me, Ezrastus, personally, individually, completely. It was a love that knew everything about me, every failing, every hidden pride, every mixed motive, and loved me anyway. It wasn't the conditional love I had imagined from God, based on my performance and adherence to rules, but the love that preceded and transcended anything I could ever do or be. The shame I had felt in the darkness didn't disappear in his presence. If anything, I became even more aware of my shortcomings. But now that shame was accompanied by something else. Hope. Not hope based on my own righteousness or religious performance, but hope rooted in the love I saw in his eyes and the grace I felt emanating from him. I fell to my knees, though I had no physical body. The gesture wasn't conscious or planned. It was the only response to being in his presence. Everything in me recognized him as Lord, not because of any religious teaching or tradition, but because of who he was. In that moment, I understood what it truly meant to worship in spirit and in truth. The light surrounding him began to shift, not just in physical colors, but in hues that seemed to carry meaning and emotion, moving like a living thing. They created patterns that spoke directly to my soul in ways words never could. Then he spoke my name, Ezra. Just that one word, but it contained universes of meaning. In his voice, I heard everything. Perfect knowledge of who I was, total understanding of my struggles and fears, unshakable love for my authentic self, and gentle correction for where I had gone astray. It was a voice that could command galaxies into existence, yet spoke to me with the intimacy of a closest friend. The reality of his presence was so overwhelming that all my carefully constructed theological arguments and religious justifications simply dissolved. None of the explanations I had prepared about why we lived as we did, why we followed our traditions, why we separated ourselves from the world, mattered anymore. In his presence, there was only truth, pure, unfiltered, and transformative. What happened next shook the very foundations of everything I believed about salvation, grace, and what it truly means to follow God. But before he spoke the words that would transform my understanding, I experienced something words can hardly capture. a complete reordering of my spiritual reality. Everything I had believed about God, faith, and salvation was about to be illuminated by the light of His truth, and nothing would ever be the same. In His presence, time seemed to stand still and flow like a river all at once. Every word He spoke carried meaning beyond mere language, penetrating deep into my soul. The conversation that followed would fundamentally reshape my understanding of faith, salvation, and God's heart. "You have sought me through rules and traditions," Jesus began, His voice resonating through my entire being. "But you have not known me." Each word carried not condemnation, but a deep sadness mingled with overwhelming love. "Your people have created many paths thinking they lead to me, but they have often become barriers instead of bridges." I wanted to defend our ways, to explain how we had preserved the pure faith through generations of careful adherence to tradition. But in His presence, such arguments felt hollow. Instead, I found myself asking, "Lord, have we been wrong all this time?" His response came with both gentleness and authority. "Not wrong in your desire to serve me, Ezra. Not wrong in your hunger for holiness or your wish to separate from worldliness, but wrong in believing that these external things could earn what I freely give." Then He showed me something that both broke my heart and healed it. I saw our community through His eyes, not just the external peace and order that visitors admired, but the internal struggles and hidden burdens. I saw children growing up believing they had to earn God's love through perfect behavior. I saw teenagers torn between their faith and their fears, believing that a single misstep could condemn them forever. I saw adults carrying the crush and weight of trying to uphold every tradition perfectly, their relationship with God reduced to a checklist of do's and don'ts. "Look deeper," Jesus instructed, and I began to see beneath the surface of our carefully structured lives. I saw the pride that often motivated our separation from others, the fear that drove our rigid adherence to traditions, and the subtle self-righteousness that had crept into our hearts. But I also saw genuine faith, sincere devotion, and real love for God, often buried beneath layers of human tradition. "Your community's desire to live simply and avoid worldliness pleases me," Jesus continued. "But these should be expressions of love, not requirements for acceptance. They should flow from a relationship with me, not replace it." He then showed me moments from my own life, times when I had chosen strict rule-following over showing compassion, when I had harshly judged others for minor infractions while overlooking the weightier matters of justice, mercy, and faith. But He also showed me times when I had genuinely sought Him, when my heart had reached for Him despite my misunderstandings. "Remember the Pharisees," He said. And suddenly, I was transported to first-century Jerusalem. They too believed strict adherence to rules and traditions would earn them salvation. They too separated themselves from others, thinking it made them holier. But what did I tell them? The words from Scripture came alive with new meaning. "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." "But Lord," I asked, feeling both defensive and uncertain, "doesn't separation from the world protect us from sin? Don't our traditions help us maintain purity?" His response was gentle yet profound. "Separation from worldliness is good, but you have often confused cultural separation with spiritual holiness. True holiness comes from being set apart for me, not from following man-made rules. The traditions themselves are not wrong, Ezra, but they must never become more important than love, more vital than grace, more central than me. Then he showed me something that filled me with both conviction and hope. I saw how our community's focus on separation and tradition had sometimes become a barrier to sharing his love with others. We had become so focused on maintaining our way of life that we had forgotten its purpose: to draw closer to God and reflect his love to the world. Your simple lifestyle can be a beautiful testimony, he said, but only if it flows from love and grace, not from fear and pride. Your separation from worldliness can point others to me, but only if it's accompanied by genuine love for those who are different. The conversation then turned more personal. Ezra, he said, I am sending you back with a message, not to destroy your community's way of life, but to infuse it with a new understanding. The outward forms can remain, but the heart must change. The traditions can continue, but they must be rooted in grace, not law. But Lord, I protested, knowing the resistance I would face. How can I explain this to my family, my community? They'll think I've lost my faith rather than found it more fully. His smile was full of compassion and determination. Some will listen, others will resist. But remember, I am with you always. Speak the truth in love. Share what you've seen and heard. Trust me to work in hearts, just as I've worked in yours. Then, he showed me a vision of hope. I saw our community transformed, not by abandoning our way of life, but by infusing it with grace. I saw families still living simply, but free from the burden of earning salvation. I saw young people choosing to stay, not from fear of punishment, but from genuine love for God and appreciation of their heritage. I saw our separation from the world becoming a testimony of love rather than a wall of exclusion. Your people have preserved many good things, Jesus said. The emphasis on community, the value of hard work, the desire to live simply. These can all be beautiful expressions of faith when they flow from grace rather than obligation. The problem comes when these good things become ultimate things, when they replace me as the source of salvation. He then showed me specific situations I would face, conversations with family members, discussions with church leaders, questions from young people. For each scenario, he provided not just words to say, but wisdom to share and love to demonstrate. Remember, he said, transformation comes not through condemnation, but through revelation. Share what you've seen of my heart. Let them see grace in action through your life. Some will be ready immediately, others will need time, and some may never accept it. Love them all. The light around us began to intensify, and I felt that our time was drawing to a close. Lord, I asked quickly, will I remember all of this? Will I have the courage to share it? You will remember what needs to be remembered, he assured me, and my grace will be sufficient for you. Your strength will fail, but mine never will. Keep your eyes on me, not on the responses of others. His final words burned deep into my soul. Remember, Ezra, salvation is not earned through works, but received through faith. It's not about what you do, but about what I have already done. Share this truth with your people. Many are ready to hear it. Then, the light became overwhelming, and I felt myself being drawn back. The return to my body was jarring. Pain flooded back, along with the sensation of cold gravel against my skin and urgent voices above me. The paramedics were still working frantically, and one of them said, we've got a pulse. My physical recovery took weeks, but the spiritual transformation was immediate and lasting. The first person I spoke to about my experience was my wife, Rebecca, who rushed to the hospital as soon as she heard about my collapse. Through tears, I tried to explain what I had seen and heard. It's not that our way of life is wrong, I told her, holding her hand as machines beeped around us. But we've sometimes made it more important than the one it's meant to honor. We've turned traditions into requirements for salvation when Jesus wants them to be expressions of love. To my surprise and gratitude, Rebecca listened with an open heart. I've always felt something was missing, she admitted quietly. I've tried so hard to be perfect, to do everything right, but it never felt like enough. That's because it was never meant to be about our performance, I said, feeling the truth of Jesus' words flow through me. It's about His grace, His finished work, His love we can't earn, but only receive. Over the following months, as my physical strength returned, I began sharing my experience with others in our community. Some, like Rebecca, were immediately receptive, recognizing in my words the answers to their own unspoken struggles. They, too, had felt the burden for performance-based faith, the constant pressure to maintain perfect adherence to every rule. Others reacted with skepticism or outright hostility. The bishop called a meeting to discuss what he called my dangerous ideas. Some suggested that my experience was simply a result of oxygen deprivation or medication, and others warned that sharing such thoughts could lead to being shunned. But Jesus' words gave me courage, and His grace proved sufficient, even in the face of opposition. I found myself filled with love for those who resisted the message. I understood their fears because I had shared them once. The idea that salvation is a gift to be received rather than a reward to be earned can be terrifying when you've built your entire life around earning it. Gradually, a quiet transformation began in our community. It didn't happen through dramatic confrontations or sudden changes to our way of life. Instead, it came through countless small conversations, through living examples of grace-based faith, through gentle challenges to legalistic thinking. Young people who had been struggling with their faith found new hope in understanding that God's love wasn't dependent on their perfect performance. Parents began teaching their children about grace alongside tradition. Even some of the church leaders, after initial resistance, began to recognize the truth in what Jesus had shown me. We didn't abandon our lifestyle or traditions. We still live simply, work hard, and maintain separation from many aspects of modern life. But these choices now flow from love and gratitude, not fear and obligation. They are expressions of our faith, not requirements for salvation. The most profound change has been in our hearts, including my own. The crushing weight of trying to earn God's favor through perfect obedience has been replaced by the joy of knowing Him personally. The fear of making mistakes or falling short of community standards has been transformed by the peace of understanding that His grace is sufficient. Today, 5 years after my experience, our community continues to evolve. We haven't lost our identity or abandoned our values, but we have found a new foundation for them, not in human tradition, but in God's grace. Some families have left, unable to accept these changes, while others have joined us, drawn by the combination of simple living and genuine grace. I still think often about those 14 minutes and 20 seconds when I was clinically dead. I think about the darkness that stripped away my religious pretenses and the light that revealed God's heart. I think about Jesus' words and how they continue to transform not just my life, but the lives of others who have ears to hear. The journey hasn't been easy. There have been costs to speaking this truth, strained relationships, questioned trust, comfort lost. But there have also been moments of incredible joy, watching others discover the freedom found in Christ's grace, seeing the light dawn in their eyes as they realize that God's love isn't something to be earned, but a gift to be received. To those reading this, whether you're Amish, English, or from any other background, know this. God's grace is greater than any religious system, any set of rules, any human tradition. His love for you isn't based on what you do or don't do, but on what He has already done through Jesus Christ. The truth that Jesus showed me that morning has forever changed my life. Salvation isn't earned through works. It's received through faith. It's not about our performance. It's about His grace. And that grace is available to everyone who will receive it, regardless of their background, culture, or traditions. As I write these final words, the sun is rising over our farm, much like it was on that life-changing morning. But now, instead of feeling the weight of trying to be good enough, I feel the lightness of knowing that in Christ, I already am. Not because of anything I've done, but because of everything He has done. This is my testimony. This is my story. But more than that, this is the truth about salvation that Jesus wanted me to share. It's not about rules. It's about relationship. It's not about performance. It's about grace. And that grace is available to you right now, just as it was to me on that extraordinary morning when I died, met Jesus, and learned the truth that set me free.